Good morning, everyone. Bom dia, buongiorno, buenos dias. That's about as far as I can go. Welcome to GUTelOnX. It's our first collaboration for a symposium between Georgetown University and UNESP, the São Paulo State University. We're very proud of this. Our collaboration began way back in 2008 with Telecollaboration using Teletandem, the context João Teles came up with almost a couple of decades ago now. And since then, we've been in touch. João Teles came to Georgetown, gave a presentation in 2009. Many of the faculty members in the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics enjoyed the presentation and the idea. And in 2010, he came to spend a semester with us and working on a class that would use Teletandem as its centerpiece. And things went so well that in 2014-15, we were lucky enough to get some extra money and extend the Teletandem experience to 8 different modern languages at Georgetown. And it was quite the year. João Teles was able to come for a full year and collaborate with us and as a consultant. And we met with professors and instructors in several different departments that yielded several fruits. We, Dr. Ron Liao in Spanish and Portuguese, ran a seminar on foreign language acquisition and technology that semester, and all the final papers were based on Teletandem data from the year that we extended the Teletandem from Portuguese to the 8 modern languages. So after that, of course, several other things happened. We've had IMFLIT was one of the experiences that came from this Teletandem collaboration, and not particularly from Georgetown. This was an initiative with UNESP and the University of Miami with Leila Acosta and Maisa Zakia. But several other things came out, such as publications and studies and so on. So we're very excited to have this first GUTelOnX. We thought it was very appropriate to have the X there today. The title was chosen on purpose. Since Teletandem originated at UNESP, we wanted to include it in the title in this collaboration, but we didn't want to limit it to Teletandem practices. We wanted to have it open to online exchange in general, right? So regarding the symposium itself, there are many people to thank, but I'm going to leave that for the final remarks at the end of the day tomorrow. But it was quite a group effort to put this together during this time. We all hope that everybody's safe and healthy wherever you are today. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do in the next 2 days, and then I'll introduce our first keynote speaker. So I see that most of you are very accustomed by now to Zoom meetings or online meetings, and you have your microphones off. I appreciate that. If you're going to send any questions, please use the chat. We have a couple of people working with me right now on the chat, and so we'll be able to answer questions. I'll be happy to answer questions about the opening remarks before I introduce our keynote speaker, our first keynote speaker. So just as an overview, you might have noticed that the full program is online with all the links, as well as the abstracts. Now we have the abstracts all set up. We will begin, if this works. Here we go. Oops, here we go. So we will begin today with Dr. Joe Cunningham talking about telecollaboration in times of crisis. But we have two more keynote speakers. Tomorrow morning, Dr. Paola Leone will be talking about teletandem and intercomprehension. And to close the day and the symposium, Dr. Solange Aranha will talk about MULTEC, a multimodal teletandem corpus and possibilities of longitudinal research in teletandem. Aside from that, of course, you will notice that for some reason this isn't working. Oh, there we go. You will also notice in the program that all the times are Brasilia time, so please pay attention. For those of you in the United States, we're an hour earlier than Brasilia. Mexico is 2 hours earlier than Brasilia, and I believe anyone in Europe would be 5 hours later, right? 5 hours later. You'll notice that the sessions indicate whether they are in English or in Portuguese. We'll have 10 sessions between today and tomorrow. 6 of these sessions will be in English, 4 of them in Portuguese, and we will run them parallel. So we'll have a session in English and a session in Portuguese for each of the time periods. I'd also like to point out that all of this is being recorded, so be careful. All of this is being recorded, and later we have a YouTube page that we are putting together where all the sessions will be there. So the order of the session, as you probably know by now because you received the emails, the order of the session will be a brief introduction by the moderators. So for example, in session 1, Maisa and Annelise will introduce the presenters and so on. The session link is readily available, as well as we have a calendar too. If somebody would like the calendar, we'll be happy to place that in the chat. And then each of the talks will be presented in sequence as listed in the program, and it will be presented. The recording will be presented, of course, right? And at the end, the authors will all be available for questions and discussion. So as you can see here, we have an example of the session 1 in English. The next session, session 2, you can see up here in the upper left side, it indicates that it's in Portuguese. And we have the moderators listed and the link, etc. So we're getting close to the time of our keynote speaker. We have almost 40 people participating in this session already. Here we got a couple more examples of sessions in English and then in Portuguese. And as I said, they're listed side by side. They're parallel. Very well. Those were my opening remarks. If somebody has questions, please feel free to place them in the chat. Otherwise, in a few minutes, I will introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Joe Cunningham, who is already online with us.
Hello, everyone. I was expecting Maisa and Michele and the organizers to to say something, but as they haven't, I would like to thank UNESP people for all their work on this. It's a great organization, and I mean, it requires a lot of effort. Thank you very much for all of you. And as the coordinator of Invite group, I would like to welcome everybody and thank all the organizers. Thank you very much.
Bom, aproveito para dar as boas-vindas a todos em português. Né? Agradecer a participação de todos vocês que estão aqui, mesmo que em horários nem sempre tão compatíveis com o do Brasil, mas se organizando para estar conosco. E esse evento ele surgiu já há muito tempo que nós conversamos, a Unesp e com a Unesp enquanto um grupo, o grupo de pesquisa, e com o Maicon e toda a equipe, não é? E deu certo. E nós estamos muito contentes, não é? Que tenhamos conseguido reunir esse grupo tão diverso, com perspectivas, às vezes, diferentes no que tange as investigações, mas todos interessados em telecolaboração. E é isso que eu gostaria de dizer, é um grande prazer estar com vocês, e eu gostaria também que a Maísa e a Michele, a Lia, esse grupo, o Edson, se está aí, é um grupo grande que trabalhou nos bastidores, não é? E para que esse evento acontecesse. É um imenso prazer, um bom dia a todos.
Bom dia a todos. Boas-vindas a todos vocês. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the event. We have chosen to use both languages to give you this welcome greeting. Nós escolhemos, então, dar as boas-vindas nas duas línguas e esperamos que todos tenham um bom evento. Teremos muito tempo disponível para as discussões. We chose this format of the videos so that we could have a lot of time for the discussions, and we hope you all have a great event. Thank you so much. Obrigada a todos, um bom dia, um bom evento.
Good morning, everyone. So thank you all for being here with us. It's a great pleasure to see all of you, some friends from Mexico, from the US, from Brazil, in different parts of Brazil. We have participants from Italy, from Portugal, from, let me see, from Germany. Any representative from any other country here? A lot of Brazilians. So we thank you all for being here with us to share your experiences on telecollaboration. United Kingdom here also. So it's a great pleasure. Thank you all for being here. Obrigada a todos por estarem aqui com a gente. Temos participantes de várias partes do mundo, participantes de Portugal, Itália, Estados Unidos, Brasil, Reino Unido, a Alemanha, e espero não estar esquecendo de nenhum, tá bom? Então, todos bem-vindos e obrigada por participarem do evento com a gente.
Since we have a few more minutes, I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Dr. Paula Leone for accepting to give a keynote. We had originally scheduled João Teles to do so, but due to personal reasons, he wasn't able to. And Dr. Leone stepped in and is going to give us a great talk tomorrow. We're looking forward to it. And it's really fitting that we have representatives from North America, South America, and Europe as keynote speakers. So that's a very nice added benefit here. Então eu queria aproveitar também para agradecer, já que todo mundo está falando português e inglês, agora me toca a mim. Queria agradecer a professora Paula Leone por aceitar convite para dar a palestra amanhã. Tínhamos convidado o professor João Teres, infelizmente ele teve que, por motivos pessoais, não pôde estar presente, e a professora Leone aceitou o convite, e estamos muito felizes com isso, e não vemos a hora de ouvir a sua palestra amanhã. Bom, I think we can begin with the introductions, since the bio here is very long. I'm just kidding. It's an impressive bio. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Cunningham. So Dr. Cunningham's interest in second language acquisition and dedication to language teaching grows out of his own language learning experiences. He has lived, taught, and learned in California, Kansas, Missouri, Germany, and the Czech Republic. In 2014, Dr. Cunningham completed his PhD at the University of Kansas, where his dissertation, The Development of Pragmatic Competence Through Telecollaboration, an Analysis of Requesting Behavior, was nominated for the Argesinger Outstanding Dissertation Prize. Situated at the intersection of technology-mediated second language pedagogy and instructive pragmatic development, his research has appeared in various peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes. In addition to studying the benefits of virtual exchange for second language learning and teacher education, Dr. Cunningham is interested in the role of telecollaboration at the curricular level. He currently serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Virtual Exchange and as a member of the executive board of Calico. Today, Dr. Cunningham will be talking about telecollaboration in times of crisis. Please welcome Dr. Cunningham. It's all yours, Joe.
Thank you. Obrigado. So, good morning, everyone. Bom dia. I'm excited to be connecting with all of you out there in both the northern and southern hemispheres. And I want to begin today by extending a special thanks to Michael Ferreira of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Georgetown University. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. I'm currently sitting at my home in Arlington, Virginia, which is about 5 or 6 kilometers away from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And like many of you, I've been stuck at home for months on end. And that's what motivated me to start thinking about what does telecollaboration offer us in these times of crisis. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I've got a few slides that I've created to support my talk. So let me go ahead and now start it up. So can everybody see those okay? All right, great. So we're currently living through the worst pandemic in a century. And while individual persons' lived experiences during this time vary dramatically, and it's certainly worth examining critically why that is, if we look briefly at these national statistics for both the USA and Brazil, they paint a pretty grim picture. We as nations find ourselves in the unfortunate position of being among the highest rates, or having the highest rates of disease transmission and disease-related fatalities. And although if you look at the trend lines that I pulled yesterday afternoon, the case rate and fatality rate in Brazil is falling, and the fatality rate in the USA is also falling. That doesn't mean that we aren't continuing to deal with a very severe public health crisis where a lot of people are getting very sick, and unfortunately many people are dying. So this is the backdrop for 3 interrelated crises. Now, as we've learned, the best practice for avoiding infection include not gathering in large numbers, especially in indoor spaces. But it's exactly these conditions that characterize the vast majority of educational institutions, from primary to post-secondary contexts. Classrooms with a lot of people sitting and learning together. So the response in much of the world was to bar physical access to schools and to move instruction online. And while some schools have returned to face-to-face instruction, many students and teachers are still online and having to deal with what I'm calling a crisis in instructional delivery. Another repercussion of the need to restrict unnecessary movement outside of the home has been a drop in our ability to travel freely, both domestically and internationally. I'm guessing if you think about the plans that you made for last summer, and then you think about the way that your summer actually turned out, you probably ended up a lot closer to home than maybe you originally had intended. This was definitely the case for me. I was supposed to lead a group of undergraduate students on a 5-week program to study abroad in Germany. And instead, the program was canceled, and neither the students nor I were able to make the trip, and I ended up teaching the course I would have taught in Germany online instead. Such cases are representative of the second crisis that will be in focus today, a crisis in student mobility. Lastly, both Brazil and the USA belong to the, and I mean it ironically now, exclusive group of nations whose leaders have actually contracted the disease. Perhaps this fact, more than any other, illustrates the respective policies and positions that these governments have adopted in response to the pandemic. The point of this talk is not to critique national responses towards the pandemic, but it is fair to say that elected officials in both countries have downplayed the severity of the threat posed by COVID-19. This skepticism stands in stark contrast to the high number of cases, which in the United States at least has led to a mismatch between information coming from the government and information coming from scientific sources. On the one hand, we get a very rosy assessment coming from government sources, and on the other hand, we get a very dire assessment coming from scientific sources. And people are left with sort of the question of, what do we believe? And as it turns out, the way people sort of accept this information tends to correlate with their political and ideological views. So this mismatch or this misalignment between different sources of information has just ratcheted up long existing ideological tensions between the political left and the political right to such an extent that we can't even agree on things like whether it is a good idea to wear a mask during a pandemic. So if we can't decide on the utility of wearing a mask, how are we going to reach any other sort of reasoned compromise? And after all, compromise is how a parliamentary democracy functions. So this third crisis, an inability to understand alternate perspectives, is very concerning for all democratic nations. So briefly to reiterate, we find ourselves facing 3 interrelated crises that stem from our global pandemic and accompanying response: a crisis in instructional delivery, a crisis in student mobility, and a crisis in our ability to understand alternate perspectives. So how do we respond to these crises? Well, for the next several minutes, I'll delve into each of these a little bit more and explain how the practice of telecollaboration or virtual exchange can offer us useful insights. So due to the rapid spread of COVID-19, the schooling of more than 1 billion children worldwide has been impacted. That's 1 billion with a B. And even if we limit this number to the post-secondary context, we're still looking at a figure of hundreds of thousands of students in the USA alone and millions on a global scale. In the USA, colleges and universities responded to the pandemic by moving their courses online. And this was definitely the case at Georgetown University. We had our spring break, and during our spring break, the decision was made to move the courses online, and we had a couple of days to prepare for that, and we did it. So this phenomenon basically illustrates how colleges and instructors were basically operating in triage mode in the spring. Large numbers of faculty who'd never taught online were responsible for teaching this way to students, and students were responsible for learning this way even though they hadn't signed up for that kind of course. So there was really just no time to build online courses using research-based practices. Now, because this is a continuing crisis, there wasn't a lot of data out there about how students have been affected, but I did manage to find this survey titled Suddenly Online that asked about 1,000 undergraduate students about their experiences taking courses online during the spring of this year. 43% of students had never taken a course online. So that's a large number of students. If not a majority, it's still a large chunk. And 95% of students connected from at home. But 44% of those students had some sort of connectivity issue. So these students who had, in many cases, never studied online before, reported some problems with their experience. Above all, motivation and not really knowing who to contact or where to seek help. So, so what do we do when we're faced with a situation like this? How do we solve this crisis in instructional delivery, where some students have experience taking online classes, many don't, some have good internet connections, many don't, some feel motivated, many don't. What do we do? Well, teachers and learners, they need to start conceiving of their educational experience differently, and they need to realize that the best practices for online instruction, in fact, differ significantly from established patterns of behavior that are associated with classroom learning. So here I'd like to share with you some more data from the Suddenly Online survey regarding predictors of student satisfaction when taking online classes. So the same 1,008 students were presented with the following list of best practices and asked to indicate whether the courses they took featured any of these practices. And then the number of those practices was correlated with the overall satisfaction rate of the students. And it turns out that those who had 0 to 2 of the recommended instructional practices were 43% satisfied overall, as compared to 61% for courses using 3 to 5 of the practices, and 74% of courses using 6 to 8 of the practices. So the implication is clear. Student satisfaction rises with the proportion of recommended practices being utilized. So now the big question, what does this have to do with telecollaboration? I would propose that the list of recommended practices for online instruction overlaps in a significant way with one of the pedagogical principles that underlie telecollaboration, especially in the teletandem context, and that is learner autonomy. Now, according to Cappellini, the principle of autonomy is linked to self-directed learning and implies that learners are responsible for their own learning. In other words, learners individually decide their own pedagogical objectives, how to reach them, and how to evaluate their learning. Now, if we unpack that definition, I think it's clear that in at least 4 of these best practices for online teaching, the principle of autonomy is clearly at work. So if we have autonomous learners, they're able to express what they have learned and what they need to continue learning. They should be able to not only they should be able to suggest alternate assessments. They should feel comfortable meeting in breakout groups during a live class session, and they should be able to work on group projects separately from the course meetings. So all of these imply the very important role of self-directed learning in an online instructional environment. So so I think that's what I really wanted to emphasize at this part of the talk was just the role of autonomy when it comes to solving the crisis of instructional delivery. But we shouldn't really think of this as being sort of the panacea. Online instruction isn't going to solve all of the problems that we're facing because of this pandemic. So we have to acknowledge the existing inequities in access to education, and that despite our best intentions, online learning may in fact be exacerbating or making these inequities even worse. We often hear talk of the notorious digital divide, where low-income students are more likely to have aged or limited computing devices and poor home internet access, and that puts them at a potential disadvantage as compared to their peers from more affluent backgrounds. Now, this is an unfortunate reality, and we have to acknowledge it. And we have to act against it if we're going to achieve broad-based and equitable achievements in online learning and in virtual exchange. So this recent study by McKinsey & Company also points out that not only has the shift to online learning threatened the quality of instruction, but it makes clear that in addition to low-income students, students of color, such as Black and Hispanic students, are more likely to receive low-quality remote instruction. So, although it appears that online learning has the potential to develop student autonomy, it's also the case that not all learning contexts are created equal, and we must still get at the underlying causes of these inequities. And for that, I'm not sure that telecollaboration can offer us an easy solution. So I'm going to transition now to a discussion of the second crisis that's manifested since the onset of the pandemic, and that is the crisis in student mobility. So during the academic year 2016-2017, about 330,000 American students studied abroad. This figure suggests that about 11% of all undergraduate students study abroad at some point during their studies. Moreover, with a growth rate of about 2% annually, study abroad is becoming a more and more popular option for undergraduate students every year. Well, that is until the pandemic struck, and that put a halt to study abroad. Most students who were abroad during spring 2020 were brought home and planning for summer 2020 and fall 2020, and even into the future beyond that, became much more complicated. So what is it, though, about study abroad that's led this experience to become so popular with students? And in other words, what are the benefits that can accrue to students who participate? The literature here is vast, and we could spend the whole talk on this topic alone. So instead, I want to present you with this table that presents the favorability ratings of 3,400 returnees from study abroad. As you can see, Dwyer and Peters surveyed the study abroad participants along 4 different strands: personal development, academic commitment, intercultural development, and career development. And in each area, relatively high marks are given, with the lowest aggregate ratings found in response to study abroad, helping to acquire career-related skills. But even there, in the 80s and 70s, in terms of acquiring the skill sets, and in the 50s to 60s, in terms of igniting an interest, it's still a majority of participants who would say that. So, given that students are less able to undertake study abroad than in previous years, let's take a look at each of these categories and see what the literature on telecollaboration has to say. And we can start by looking at a survey of telecollaboration in the European context that was done by Francesca Helm in 2015. The graph you're seeing here represents the responses of 131 students who participated in telecollaboration and responded to questions regarding its usefulness. Now, what we see here is maybe, I guess I would say, an overlap in 2 areas. Whereas 86% of respondents commented that of study abroad respondents commented that it reinforced their commitment to language learning, 56% of telecollaboration participants believe that it improved their foreign language skills. So we have there not an exact one-to-one. On the one hand, study abroad seems to reinforce commitment, but doesn't actually, at least in this data, indicate whether it enhances foreign language learning. There is, of course, an assumption that it does, and there are many studies that point this out, especially as regards interlanguage pragmatic development. But when it comes to the telecollaboration context, it's not characterized as commitment, but actual skill acquisition. When it comes to the career related development, in study abroad, 76% said they acquired skills that influenced their career path, and 38% of respondents in telecollaboration said they developed skills that make them more employable. So one is about influencing the choice of the career, and the other is about attaining a particular career due to the skills that have been developed. So as you can see, this kind of sort of comparison is pretty rough, and there's not a whole lot of correlation between the 2 surveys. But that doesn't mean that the literature doesn't have something to tell us. And in fact, let me go ahead and, okay, so looking at we're going to take now these 4, actually, let me go back a second to this slide. So we're going to take these now 4 categories: personal development, academic commitment, intercultural development, and career development, and see what the literature on telecollaboration has to say about them in detail. So when it comes to personal development, the literature focuses really in on the idea of confidence. And we see even way back in 2002, that in e-tandem style exchanges, this can encourage familiarity and solidarity, reducing anxiety, and even over time, increasing confidence. In a much later study, El Hariri found that the same context, e-tandem, reduces anxiety, but she goes further to basically say the reason for that is because it allows students to basically communicate outside the watchful eye of the teacher. So they feel a little bit freer to communicate without necessarily the feeling that they're being watched and evaluated. And that can lead to an increase in confidence. This most recent study that just came out this year by Fondo and Giacobetti basically looks at anxiety in the virtual language or virtual exchange context, not so much as to make the point that it reduces anxiety, but to basically disambiguate the fact that there's different kinds of anxiety that can occur during telecollaboration. Some anxiety is based in language ability, and some anxiety can be based in ability to successfully navigate the technological environment. So if participation in telecollaboration can help to reduce language anxiety, then perhaps it can also help to reduce anxiety related to technology. And that can certainly then, yeah, be of benefit to our students. So to our learners. Okay, so moving on then to the idea of academic commitment. So the studies by Schenker here confirm that students' motivation remained high throughout a 12-week email-based exchange. And the reason that their levels of interest and their motivation remained high is because they had an opportunity to explore an array of cultural practices and perspectives that not only addresses their interests, but then eventually prepares them to live in a pluralistic and multicultural society, and may in fact help to prepare them for a complementary study abroad or student mobility experience. The second study by Jauregui and co-authors basically concludes that implementing telecollaboration with first language speakers in foreign language courses can have a positive impact on the motivation of language learners. And this is interesting because that study took place really with lower level learners at the A2 and B1 levels of the Common European Framework of Reference. And especially with the lower proficiency learners, A2 learners, this effect on sustained and increased motivation was seen as particularly strong. So that's kind of interesting because we often think about telecollaboration and virtual exchange happening with learners of comparatively higher proficiency so that they're able to complete a variety of tasks. Okay, so I want to move on now to talk a little bit about career development. So as we saw from the study abroad survey, this was the area that was rated the lowest. And we saw also in the Helm survey that only 38% of students said that they developed skills that would enhance their employability. Now, I would think, and I would contend that the model of telecollaboration known as collaborative online international learning is especially conducive to the development of career-related skills, because in this model of telecollaboration, you really have two professors that are internationally dispersed from one another, working on a common syllabus. And from that common syllabus, both classes are essentially taught as one class. So you have this very tight collaboration happening between the two groups in order to complete the tasks and engage with the course material. It's certainly not done in the style of like a teletandem exchange where it's 1 hour with languages separated and so on. These tend to be lingua franca exchanges in English, sometimes in a different language, but often in English. And the course titles that I've pulled here from the COIL website basically, I think, illustrate a couple of areas where one could argue they are directly relevant to career-related skills. I cannot imagine a student, participating in dairy production and management, in a dairy production and management course, unless they had some particular interest in that field. I mean, even liberal arts students at United States colleges wouldn't probably be required to take a course like that, even though they have some pretty funny degree requirements sometimes. So And then internet marketing, global workplace, global citizenship, and corporate social responsibility, they all imply a focus on developing skills that will be needed for the global marketplace. And then I think a topic that we should spend some time talking about, and it's really, this is implicit, I think, but it bears stating very explicitly that telecollaboration is excellent for educating future teachers. And of course, being a teacher is a career. So we have to think about that branch of research that basically shows that participation in telecollaboration and engagement with other pre-service or in-service teachers in a virtual context, that experience is very valuable in developing the skills that those teachers will need to conduct their own telecollaboration or virtual exchanges when they are the no longer pre-service teachers, but in-service teachers. In my own research with my colleague Mariana Ryshina-Pankova in the German department at Georgetown, we did a study of the synchronous interactions between graduate students taking a teacher education course in the United States at Georgetown and a similar population of students taking a course at the University of Trier in Germany. And so using a systemic functional linguistic perspective, we were looking at the kinds of attitudes that students were expressing as they participated in a telecollaboration. And the point of this telecollaboration was to select a text and develop a learning sequence and learning materials that are in line with a literacy-based framework. And what we found is that they were able, through their dialogue with one another, not only to display their abilities to select appropriate texts and develop related materials, but they could express their beliefs and attitudes that are related to the core competencies of a telecollaborative teacher, including a willingness to compromise, a willingness to consider pedagogical beliefs that are different from their own, and so on. So in sum, by evaluating themselves and their own ideas, as well as those of their partner, in the context of synchronous audiovisual communication, the participants could negotiate and co-construct a mutual understanding of pedagogical competencies, including text selection, materials development, and other factors governing important pedagogical decisions. So, to conclude my discussion of this part of the talk, I want to touch on the single most well-researched phenomenon when it comes to telecollaboration, and that is the idea of intercultural development, or sometimes intercultural communicative competence, if you're working with Byram's framework. But I want to subsume that sort of into this idea of intercultural development. So there are many, many studies out there. So I'm just going to focus in on a few that create sort of a chronology of how this has been researched. And we can start with O'Dowd, who in 2003 did this longitudinal study of a telecollaboration between Spain and the United States, focusing really on the email exchange that the students participated in. And what he showed was that there was a willingness to express individuals' cultural identities, and there was a sensitivity to others' needs in order to make, it was necessary to be sensitive to others' needs in order to make the virtual exchange a success. We could also look at the study by Jin and Erbin that shows how students of Chinese, so American learners of Chinese, developed intercultural sensitivity and showed respect for cultural differences by taking part in an online exchange that basically consisted of instant messaging. More recently, Lee and Markey, they showed that students viewed an online exchange as a really excellent venue for intercultural communication with native speakers. And through these sorts of social engagements, students not only gained cultural knowledge, but became more aware of their own beliefs and attitudes towards the culture. And that in particular really, I think, resonates with this idea of the fact that also in study abroad, students become more reflective of their own culture, not just the target culture. So there's a nice parallel happening there between telecollaboration and study abroad. So I think a nice transition then from the idea of what are the parallels between study abroad and telecollaboration, and moving to our third crisis is by looking at this quote from a recent article by Capellini and Macrae. So in the teletandem context, they say that the objective is not to force the students to take the other's perspective, but rather to be able at least to understand it. So through the process of intercultural development and negotiation of cultural phenomenon, it may be that students are already starting to then address the third crisis, the crisis in our ability to understand alternate perspectives. So how is it that two individuals can look at the same phenomenon and come up with two completely different interpretations of it? Well, it has to do, of course, with the fact that everyone's lived experiences shapes the way that they view the world and their place in it. So in order for us to understand how those who are other, or those who are different from us, how they view the world, I think it's really important to engage in a process of critical dialogue. But there needs to be a space where that can happen. And what I would say is, that what I would contend here is that telecollaboration and virtual exchange can provide just that kind of space where we can develop an ability to understand alternate perspectives. And hopefully with this ability, it will transition back into a non-online context, into a face-to-face context, into a physical context, where we're making an effort to understand the perspective of those who we may not necessarily agree with, but have to coexist with in our respective societies. So let me touch here on three models of telecollaboration. So, and in terms of teletandem, of course, I know that GUTeLONX is particular about referring to it as a context of telecollaboration, and so I want to be sure that I do that as well. So Solea Connect, if you're not familiar with it, basically is a web-based video conferencing technology that connects students at universities in the United States and the Middle East through weekly online meetings. And they collaborate on projects and they discuss current events. And the idea here is that these are moderated discussions. So there are 1 to 2 individuals who are not affiliated with either institution, who are specifically trained to help the student participants to navigate difficult dialogues, to avoid making rash judgments, to express themselves so that things aren't construed in absolute terms. And by engaging in this sort of nuanced and critical dialogue with one another, participants find that they increase their awareness not only of a diversity of opinions across the globe, but also in their own classroom. Now, interestingly, Georgetown has participated in the Celia Connect program with students from the School of Foreign Service at the main campus, and they're connecting with students at our Doha campus in Qatar. So in order for those students who ostensibly are students at the same university to develop a mutual understanding of their worldviews and to develop an ability to see alternate perspectives, these students have engaged in the sort of dialogue that is housed on the Celia Connect platform. So the next model I want to talk about, or the next approach I want to talk about, is the idea of cultura. So cultura was developed a couple decades ago now, back at MIT originally, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston in the United States. And originally for learners of French who were engaged in a telecollaboration with learners of English in France. And here, the focus is not so much on language acquisition, and for that reason, there's actually a lot of the first language being used in addition to the second language being used. But the idea is that students want to, instructors want our students to understand more than the meanings that are associated with particular words and concepts in their own particular sphere, in their own particular cultural sphere. So participants from both sides will receive an identical list of words and an identical set of sentences to complete in their first languages. And then they will complete the word association and the sentences in their first languages. And then in subsequent stages, the students, together with their teachers, start to analyze how these things might be different. So, for example, a word association related to the idea of freedom might elicit in Americans notions of patriotism, notions of national pride, and so on and so forth. Whereas in the French context, the idea of freedom might be related more to individual liberties that people have in the context of the French democracy. And so getting at how, so through these word associations, participants are able to kind of get beyond sort of the dictionary meanings of these words and get at the cultural associations that are packed into these words. And that's just the beginning. So that basically sets the stage for a long period of mutual engagement between the classes, where a variety of cultural artifacts are examined critically to find areas of similarity and areas of distinction between the two cultures. So, so finally, I want to talk about the teletandem context, a context that is familiar to many, many of you who are participating today. And so I don't think I need to explain all of the characteristics of a teletandem exchange, but I do want to highlight the three principles that are often cited in the literature. I spoke about autonomy briefly earlier in my talk, and now I want to zero in on the idea of reciprocity. What I do for you is what you do for me. So a new sort of formulation of the idea of reciprocity is given here in this definition by Capellini. So what I want to highlight in that definition is the fact that we have a given socio-cultural situation. So these communicators are embedded in their own lived experiences within a greater socio-cultural context. And something happens where there is an obligation to respond according to an acknowledged convention. And this helps to build social relationships. So how does reciprocity then apply in the idea of engaging in difficult or critical dialogue with others outside of the classroom, outside of the virtual exchange? Well, I really want to, I really like the idea that we have an obligation to others to respond with an acknowledged convention. So the idea that we can engage with one another, that we can rely on the conventions that normally govern our interaction. And here you could think about sort of the Gricean maxims that govern our communication. We want to be relevant, we want to be truthful, we want to seek basically a good outcome for our interlocutors. So if we take that as a given, then we can approach dialogue and conversation with others who may disagree with us, but the intention is there that we're going to seek that common ground and we're going to seek a mutual benefit from the dialogue. So the starting place needs to be one of reciprocity. And here, at the risk of getting political again, I would argue that that comes from leadership. We need leadership that foregrounds unity rather than leadership that stokes division and strife. Okay, so with my talk, I hope to have made the case for the fact that even though we find ourselves at a moment of overlapping crises, we have a path forward, and that's reflected in the principles and practice of telecollaboration. In terms of instructional delivery, we've recognized the importance of learner autonomy. Students need to be ready to take responsibility for their learning, entering into a partnership with the instructor, rather than passively reacting to disruptions to our learning contexts. As regards the crisis of student mobility, telecollaboration provides a context where personal development can occur, academic commitment can be exercised, career skills may be enhanced, and intercultural understanding can be achieved. On this last point, intercultural understanding can also help to promote understanding of alternate perspectives. Here we've reviewed 3 contexts of telecollaboration: Solia, Cultura, and Teletandem, in order to show that even within diverse contexts, telecollaboration can help participants to understand alternate perspectives and become global citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. That was excellent. Thank you so much. We can open now for questions if anybody has questions.
Yes, I'm happy to take any and all questions. I look forward to the discussion.
It's kind of odd, right, after a talk in this setting that we're used to seeing, people applauding, and I saw Solange going like this, to hear that silence. But I'm sure everyone appreciated your words.
Oh no, I fully understand it. I mean, it seems like half my life is on Zoom these days. And so, I mean, the conventions of, communicating via Zoom, I mean, you have to have sort of, it kind of gets back to the understanding that we're not operating in the same way that we do in a physical space. So, yeah. So I appreciate everyone's good thoughts and reactions.
We have our first question here from Susie Cavallari. She says, Dr. Cunningham, congratulations on the wonderful talk. How do you see the role of teacher in telecollaborative learning?
Yes, thank you for the question. So my view of the teacher in telecollaborative learning is that the teacher is the facilitator. I think it was Rob O'Dowd and Marcus Ritter who coined the term the guide on the side. And that's the way that I see the role of the teacher. The teacher is integral when it comes to organizing the telecollaboration, when it comes to selecting tasks, when it comes to negotiating with the partner teacher, but all of that planning kind of happens sort of at the front end, or even before the commencement of the partnership between the classes. Once the partnership commences, all of that carefully laid groundwork hopefully contributes to the success of the learners' autonomous interactions with one another. And as those interactions proceed, of course, it's also the teacher's responsibility, and I think this will appeal to those of you who are in the teletandem context, to help mediate the experiences that the students are having, where they have a forum either through written blogs or through in-class discussion, that they can communicate their questions and as needed concerns to the teacher, who will help to maybe reframe those questions or concerns in a way that helps them to become more aware of how things operate in the target culture, and so that there is less risk, I think, of individuals maybe misconstruing certain messages that have been sent that maybe are culturally embedded. So that's what I would see as some of the main roles of the teacher, as being the organizer, the facilitator, and the mediator.
Okay, we have another question here from Viviane Klein Alves. I also have a question: how to assess student participation in teletandem interactions, especially when the telecollaborative exchange is done outside of the classroom. I'm not talking about the tasks students complete, but how to assess the participation in the sessions.
That's tricky. And I sympathize with the teacher who wants to assess their telecollaboration or their virtual exchange. And there's ways that that this has been done. But as you point out, generally the assessment is connected to the tasks, not to the actual interaction in the teletandem sessions. So my own feeling is that there's two approaches to this, I would say. In light of wanting to have learners be autonomous, you could engage the learners in developing some sort of assessment mechanism for how to assess their participation, whether that be through the number of turns that they start, the quality of maybe they could rate the depth of the discussion that they had, whether it remained relatively superficial, talking about some of those more like the 4 F's: foods, festivals, fairy tales, or whether it got into a little bit of a deeper comparison of cultural phenomenon. So that's one way to engage the students, is to have them come up with some suggestions about how to assess that, with the teacher again guiding and facilitating. Or it may be that it's sufficient to simply say that participation in the teletandem sessions counts as such. You have participated. You get credit for participation. In the way that when I assign sort of simple homework assignments for my beginning level German learners, I assess them for completion, knowing that there will be some mistakes in there, but these mistakes can also be learning opportunities. So it may be that that's a way to go about assessing that. And then when it comes to the actual quality of the products that they produce, then you can be a little bit more nuanced in the way that you would want to assign points. Again, maybe with student feedback and buy-in.
Is that good, Viviani, or do you? No, thank you. Okay, so our next question comes from Marta Hernandez. Dr. Cunningham, perhaps the biggest challenge in learning autonomy is that students accept responsibility for their own learning. How can we best help students become autonomous while we guide and facilitate their learning?
I think we should tell them to be autonomous. I mean, I think we should be explicit about it. I think we should say, you know, when we learn, I mean, maybe you can frame it as, and I remember a teacher saying this to me once too. My job is not to help you learn all of the German language. My job is to help you become your own teacher so that you can continue to learn when I'm not there anymore. And I think telling students that it makes a difference, because I think some students, they've gone through so many years of schooling, and it's always been the case that the teacher has kind of decided, or the curriculum has decided for them what they're going to learn, but they eventually need to see that they need to direct their own learning. So I think engaging them in that kind of discussion, challenging them to become autonomous, is the way to go about doing that. And some will be much more successful than others, and some will continue to rely more heavily on the teacher than others, and that's just the nature of individual learners.
Great. You got a thank you very much there, and a congratulations, great talk. Thank you so much from Sylvia Salai.
Now, thanks for the great questions, everyone.
We still have a few minutes if you'd like, if someone would like to ask one last question. Okay. Well, I think we can close the session. I will leave the session open until for the next 7 minutes, because we still had that budgeted in our time allotment. But I will turn off my screen because I have to open up the session 1 and 2 that's coming up now after this. So last chance, anyone got a question? Oh yeah, please notice that if anyone needs a certificate attesting that you were present at the symposium, Michelle Souza just added the attendance form on Google Forms with the link. So just fill that out and we'll set something up for you and email it to you. Since there's nothing else, Joe, any final words?
Well, I just want to say once again, thanks everyone for attending the talk. Thanks for the great questions, and thanks again, Michael, for the invitation to join this morning. Maybe I'll see some of you in another one of the keynote sessions tomorrow.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take care, everyone.
Take care.